morning. No, I think I have a mistake. I always have one at least each Sunday in your bulletins in the insert. I think it says week 13. We're actually in week 14 of our Abraham series. And that puts us in Genesis chapter 23. We're going to finish off this series next week. And then we'll get into another series that's going to last about 8 weeks. Will take us up to Thanksgiving. But next week we'll look a little bit at Genesis chapter 24. That's more a story about Abraham's son getting his wife. We'll talk a little bit about that. And we're going to finish up really talking about just the importance of Abraham throughout this series and why I think this series was an important one for us to look at. This past week in the news, we've seen a very important death for our world. With Queen Elizabeth passing away overseas, and that'll be remembered, especially for a long time to come. It'll be written about in history books. But today we're looking at Sarah's death and burial. We don't get a whole lot of information about her death, but in this scene right here, what we get a scene here with Sarah's death and burial that we don't get very often in the Bible. We get the story of really what happens with her body after she dies and the process that takes place. Abraham has to bury his wife. And as we're going to see today, he has no place to bury her. And I think today we see just how important Sarah was and meant to Abraham, but not just for Abraham, but for generations to come. Many years ago, there was an artist who painted a picture. It was a mountain, and the mountain was just a picture of a bunch of skulls. I know it sounds kind of creepy, but at first glance, they all looked the same, but when you looked closer at each one of the skulls, you saw a word written on it. It was doctors, teacher, banker, lawyer, whatever, all kinds of them. There were hundreds of skulls, and they each had a different occupation on it. And what the artist was trying to portray was that death is the great leveler. That no matter what your position is in life, we're all going to eventually die. Rich, poor, beggar, no matter what we are, no matter what we have in life, sooner or later we're going to die. We can't escape death no matter how much we try. We can extend life so much with medicals, how far we've come in the medical field, but at some point in time, sooner or later, we're going to die. It's something that many people don't even like to think about. But there's another side to this truth. From the standpoint of the Christian faith, it is at death that the real difference becomes apparent. And I'm not talking about wealth, fame, power, accomplishments, anything like that, because when we die, those things are gone. They don't matter anymore. It's at that point that everything is no longer hidden from anyone, because everything will be known as we appear before our Creator. So it's how we live, it's how we love, it's how we serve. Those are the things that's really going to matter when we die. Well, when we look at Sarah here in Genesis chapter 23, when we look at the life of Sarah, some people can look at Sarah and their immediate thoughts are negative thoughts of Sarah. In the story of Abraham, most of the story in all these chapters is covering Abraham, but Sarah plays her parts. Sarah and Abraham both came up with the scheme, I guess, to tell the half-truth, half-lie in Egypt and with King Abimelech 2 different times that they were brothers, so that they could spare Abraham's life and make sure that he lived. Sarah was the one who had Hagar and Ishmael sent off. But Sarah plays a very important role in the Bible. You know, she was right there with Abraham. When Abraham was 75 years old, she was 65 when they packed up everything and did what God told them to do and leave to a foreign land. She stood by his side for 25 years from that point on until the promised son Isaac came. The role she played in the Bible of bringing the promised son Isaac into the world, leading to a lineage that would have King David and Solomon and other great people, all the way down to Jesus Christ, the Messiah, was crucial. So let's not forget just how much Sarah really means to this story of Abraham. As we're going to see today, she meant a great deal to Abraham. In the Bible, there are not many deathbed scenes. We may get quick stories in the Bible of how some people die, but We don't get many stories of people when they were on their deathbeds. Over and over throughout the Old Testament especially, we generally just get a statement that says, so-and-so lived so many years and died. Often we don't even know where they were, or what happened, or how they died. We just know they lived so many years and died. We don't get a lot of last words from people in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament. Now in the New Testament, we get even less information. Other than Jesus, we don't read in the New Testament about how any of those other major characters died. Even Paul, as major as he was of a character in the New Testament, we don't read in the New Testament how he died. There are, throughout history, throughout other books written, throughout other letters that were written, we have learned how many of these people died in that first century. But the reason being, I think, is that most of those New Testament writers, they were not interested in writing about how these characters died. We know how Jesus died, very important, and so that is well documented. We know in the New Testament how Judas died, also well documented. We know how Stephen died in Acts chapter 7. There may be one or two others, but that's really about it. The New Testament has very little to say about how people died and when they died, because their writings were really about life and receiving new life in Jesus Christ. And I say all that because it's interesting when you get to Genesis chapter 23 that the death of Sarah and her burial is not just a quick little mention like we're used to in the Bible. We get the entire story about how she died and then she is buried in Genesis chapter 23. Genesis 23 tells that story quickly of her death, but then how Abraham has to purchase land to bury his wife Sarah. The report of her death is given in the first two verses of Genesis 23. Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. And Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and weep for her. So this is how chapter 23 opens up. And then the next 18 verses in the chapter are all about Abraham bargaining or negotiating, you could say, with some Hittites, Ephron the Hittite especially, to buy a field with a cave in it so that he could bury his wife. They obviously didn't bury people the same way we do today. And while it may not seem important, this type of story, it was important because when Abraham does this, Sarah is being buried in the land that came to be known as the Promised Land, the land of Canaan, the land that would become known and is now known as the nation of Israel, the land that the descendants of Abraham would eventually own. But before you get into the death of Sarah, I want to just look for a couple of minutes briefly at Sarah in the Bible. For starters, and I mentioned this early on in this series, her name was not Sarah at first, it was Sarai, at least that's how I say it. And God changed her name to Sarah. She's the only woman in the Bible to have her name changed by God. The name Sarai means my princess. But God changed her name to Sarah, signifying that she would be princess to all. And that's very important because this is what God had said to Abraham just a few chapters earlier in chapter 17. It says, and God said to Abraham, as for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her name Sarah, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her. She was no longer just a princess. Now she was going to be the princess of all, the princess of many nations. You could say the mother of many nations. See, Sarah in the Bible has a legacy of being a woman of faith in the Bible. That's her legacy really in the Bible, a woman of faith, even though she wasn't perfect. In Hebrews chapter 11, it's that chapter, I bring it up often here, the faith chapter that lists a lot of Old Testament people and the great faith they had and how they are known as their faith. But in Hebrews 11 and verse 11 we read this, that by faith Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Sarah might get a bad rap sometimes for some of the things that she did in life. But she is forever known as a woman of great faith. And why? Because even though she was old, even though she was past the age of childbearing, as the verse says right there, she still considered God, the one who had promised them a son, to be faithful. You know, Sarah once laughed, didn't she, when she heard that God was going to give them a child at such an old age. Because it was unthinkable for it would happen. Not at their age. But her laugh was turned into a laugh of amazement, of triumph. It was then, as she had the kid, after she had Isaac, that she said, God has made me laugh, and all who hear will laugh with me. She also said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? For I have borne him a son in his old age. Who would have said that? Only God said it, and only God could say it, and only God could make it happen. And so for thousands of years now, almost around 4,000 years or so, people are not laughing at Sarah, but they are laughing with Sarah, because God's promise was fulfilled. Sarah is truly one of the women of great faith in the Bible, and there are many. She came to understand and know that no obstacle was too difficult for God to overcome, that nothing was too hard for God to accomplish. That's the faith she had. That's the faith we need to have. That's Sarah in the Bible. But in Genesis chapter 23, her life comes to an end. Sarah dies. And I want us to just remember a couple of obvious facts. One of them is very obvious, facts about death. The first and obvious one is that we will all die. Nothing earth-shattering there for you. We all know that. It's understandable. It's common knowledge that we're all going to die at some point in time. As I said, we can extend life with medicine and with the medical field, how far we advance, but we know we're going to die. And it's often something that we as humans do not look forward to. There are many Christians I know who have gotten near the end of their life. They knew it was coming, and they were ready for it. And they were wanting to die so that they could be in the presence of God. But it's a fundamental truth that many people just don't like to face. They're afraid of it. Hebrews 9:27, it says, and just as it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment. We all die. Now think about what that word appointed means there. What it's saying is that we are destined to die. It's going to happen. And so when we think about appointments in our day and time, we all have certain appointments that we have to keep. Whether it's doctor's appointments, this week you might have several. Whether it's doctor's appointments, whether it's just a meeting with somebody or making sure you go see somebody or talk to someone. And let's face it, there are times when we are late for those appointments. There are times when we even forget we have an appointment. And we don't get to it and we have to reschedule. That happens in a fallen world. But there's always one appointment we're never going to miss. And that is death. The second important fact about death is that death is where the real difference is seen in us. You know, in my position, you get asked to do funerals. Many of you have probably as well been asked to speak at funerals for loved ones. And while we don't enjoy funerals, it's an honor if somebody asks you to speak for a funeral. Funerals are typically not things we enjoy. Now, we call them many times a celebration of life, and for some people they are. But there are others where it becomes difficult. Either because you just don't know the person, or because you know that they don't know Jesus Christ. And it becomes difficult to do a funeral during those times. And then there are those funerals for Christians. They're just different. Tears are still shed. There's still crying. There's still sadness. But as Christians, we mourn the fact that we lose someone we love, but we rejoice in the fact that they are in the arms of Jesus. That's where the real difference is in us. As Christians, we've seen how faithful God is over and over, especially in this series with Abraham. And for us today, the difference is seen in us because the faithful God always keeps His promises. And His promise is that all who belong to Him, all who are Christians, all who are followers of Jesus Christ, will spend eternity in His presence after we die. We all die. But what a difference it is for the Christian. So as we get back into Genesis chapter 3 here with Sarah, let's look at the rest of the chapter and how it goes. Because immediately it opens up with Sarah dying. Abraham goes in to mourn for her and he weeps. And I like it when the Bible talks about men who weep in the Bible. Because in our day and age, sometimes people consider it weak for a man to cry. Sometimes people think they aren't man enough if they cry. Well, we see Abraham here wept for his wife Sarah. In the New Testament, we read that Jesus wept for his friend Lazarus, and every time I think about that, I think about Joan's question to me. Did Jesus weep because because Lazarus was dead, or because he had to bring him back to life? Because bringing him back to life means he's got to stay here on earth longer, and he's not in the arms of Jesus. He's not in heaven. It's a good question, one I don't know the answer to. However you look at it, weeping, crying, it's part of life. And it's not just okay, it's normal to weep for loved ones. So Abraham goes in and he weeps for Sarah. But then Abraham has to purchase a field. His wife has died. He has nowhere to bury her right now. So let's read these next few verses, 3 through 9, to see what happens next. It says, "And Abraham rose up before his dead, and he said to the Hittites, I am a sojourner and foreigner among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. The Hittites answered Abraham, Hear us, my Lord. You are a prince of God among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will withhold from you his tomb to hinder you from burying your dead. Abraham rose and bowed to the Hittites, the people of the land. And he said to them, If you are willing that I should bury my dead out of my sight, hear me, and entreat for me Ephron the son of Zohar, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he owns. It is at the end of his field. For the full price, let him give it to me in your presence as property for a burying place. Now, when I read those verses, there are a couple things that stand out to me automatically. One is, the things I noticed, is that when Abraham begins this kind of negotiation here, talking with the Hittites about getting a field, he is 137 years old at this time. And he's basically been living in the land of Canaan, except for when they went to Egypt with that famine. But he's basically been living in the land of Canaan since he was 75 years old. Yet he still doesn't own any property or a place where he could bury his wife. No place. He even calls himself a sojourner, a foreigner among them, after living there for that long. They don't see him that way. They say, You're a prince of God among us. They know how powerful he is. They've seen what God has done for him, how much he's been blessed. But he still has no place to bury his wife. You know, in America, most people, we take for granted something like a home. Just the fact that we have a place to live. We just do. We either own a home, or we would like to, or we rent a home, or whatever it is. But we take for granted often our place to live, whatever it is. Well, Abraham left Ur of the Chaldeans at the age of 75. He's now 137 years old, and he still doesn't have a place to bury his wife. He doesn't even have a house. You know where he was living, where he was sleeping? Hebrews 11:9, it says, By faith he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him in the same gospel. The man known as having the greatest faith of all time lived in tents. Now, that was very common during those days. It also made it easy for them. You notice when you read in the Old Testament, especially back in Genesis, people picked up and moved to different lands. It made it a lot easier. You can pick up a tent and move it a lot easier than you can a house. So that was very common practice. It even tells us that Isaac and Jacob lived in tents as well. See, we kind of take owning a house for granted, I think, here in America. It's just what you're supposed to do, I guess. It's supposed to be a sign of prosperity. It tells maybe how much money you make or what kind of job you have. But in Abraham's day, that wasn't how someone measured how much wealth you had. It was typically done by how much livestock you had and how big your family was. Obviously, if someone lived in a palace and they had large sums of money, they were considered rich. But some people were just considered rich if they had a large livestock. Well, Abraham had both. In Genesis 13:2, we read this. Now Abraham was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. So there you have it. Abraham was a wealthy man, and we already knew this. He had it all when it came to being considered a rich man. He had it all except for a place to bury his wife. And him having all this silver and gold and being very rich in it, it's obvious that he's wealthy in the way that he offers to pay full price to bury his wife. Now the Hittites, they say, we'll just give it to you. Just take a tomb, we'll give you the best one we've got. But he wants to pay full price for it. He's not looking for a handout here. Kind of takes me back to chapter 14 of Genesis, when Abraham goes and rescues Lot. He defeats those kings and comes back, and the king of Sodom tries to tell him, you can have all the goods that you won from your battle. But Abraham wouldn't take it. Why? Because he did not want any person on earth to be able to say that they either made him rich or helped make him rich. He wanted all the glory to go to God. You kind of see that happening here. Abraham doesn't say it, but he's not taking any handouts. He wants to pay full price. He wants to purchase this field, and he was going to do it the right way. Now, at first, the Hittites, they offer him the choicest, the best of their tombs, which would have been a cave. And Abraham understood the way things worked here. He'd been in this land a long time at this point. Almost half of his life had been here. So he understood how things work. He's supposed to come back and make an offer himself. So he just offers, I'll pay full price for it. It's not the way typical negotiations and bargaining were done there. But he wanted a piece of land to own his wife so that he could bury Sarah, and she could rest in peace and dignity. And remember this, Abraham has been promised this land of Canaan already by the faithful God. So this is the place, the entire land of Canaan, where his descendants would eventually be buried for years and centuries to come. And he wanted Sarah to be in this place. So he basically plays like, let's make a deal with Ephron the Hittite especially. And I'm not going to read these verses, but in verses 10 through 20, Abraham and Ephron, they come to an agreement so that Abraham can purchase his field to bury his wife in the cave. Ephron offers to just give it to Abraham. Just, you can have it. But Abraham refuses that. He wants to pay for it. He wants to own it. So Ephron comes back with the price of 400 shekels of silver. That would be considered as twice what this field was actually worth, which was very normal for an offer. Because if you've been to markets, sometimes they ask something and you give out you respond with a lower price, and you kind of meet somewhere in the middle. That's what Abraham's supposed to do here. But Abraham doesn't even play the game. He just cuts out the bargaining and says, I'll pay the full price for it. Remember, he's very rich. So he just wants to pay for it. He wants to get this so he can own it, so he can have a place to bury his wife. And a place where he could be buried at some point in time as well. Both Ephron and Abraham, they knew what's going on here through this little process. If Abraham had accepted this field for free, most likely Ephron would have been insulted, because that's not what you're supposed to do. And he most likely, or he could have rescinded the offer. Who knows where Sarah's body would have been? It's just the way business was done. But something else I think is happening here. Moses, when he's writing this story, when he's writing Genesis, he's making it clear that Abraham bought this land legally. It's his, and nobody can legally just take it away from him. In these verses, it's kind of like a deed of purchase that we see. You get an exact location of this cave. You get an agreed upon price. You get some kind of dimensions of this field. It says it included the cave, it included the field, all the trees that are in the field. and you have witnesses there who saw the transaction. And so it's at this time, and only at this time and in this way, that Abraham buys the land to bury his wife Sarah. Now, having said all this today's been a lot about Sarah more than anything, but people still wonder why so much space is given or taken up here in Genesis about her death and burial. A whole chapter. Why is it so important? Why was it so important to Abraham? Why was it so important that Moses included all of this? For over hundreds of years, why was it so important? Why is it so important for us today, almost 4,000 years later? He didn't take Sarah back to their original home in Ur of the Chaldeans. Instead, he buries her in the land that God promised to give his descendants. And Abraham now officially owns part of that land. You could say that the takeover of the land of Canaan, the promised land, starts here, not in the book of Judges, because Abraham already owns a part of it. Now, obviously, things happen. The descendants of Abraham, they have to leave because of a famine. They go to Egypt. They become slaves for over 400 years. But Abraham thought it was so important to purchase this land that he was willing to pay whatever was asked, whatever price it took, so that it would be legal and so that it would be his. And so as we close, in many ways, we here today, we're kind of standing where Abraham stood some 4,000 years ago, knowing that we all die, one by one. We have funerals. We have burials. We weep when our loved ones die. And like Abraham, we've not received all that God has promised us yet. God promised Abraham the land of Canaan. It's called the promised land for a reason. All of it. Now that would later come through his descendants. And for us today, God has given us the promise of eternal life through Jesus Christ. For those who follow him. For those who put their faith in him. For people who are willing to confess him, to repent him, to be immersed in the waters of baptism, to have your sins washed away. People who are willing to live faithful lives for God. So in this sermon on Sarah's death and burial, I think the point of Genesis 23 is still true today. And that's simply this. We will die, but the promises of God live on forever. I want to thank you for joining us this morning for our 14th week in this Abraham series. We're going to finish it off next week before we jump into a new series for the fall. But I think it's been an interesting series, just seeing the faithfulness of Abraham, the faithfulness of God, how God keeps his promises. And God has given us a promise that to those who belong to him, we would have eternal life in heaven. If you've never made that decision to give your life to Jesus Christ, to put your faith in him, to confess him before people, to repent, as we said last week, to place your allegiance in Jesus Christ over all the other things of this earth, be immersed in the waters of baptism. If you've never made that decision, you have the opportunity to do it now. If you're just looking for a church to attend to make your home, we would love for Double Creek to be that place for you. We're going to stand and sing our hymn of invitation here this morning. In the first and last verse of song number 212, Only Trust Him.